Hello everybody. In this video we're going to be talking about the fall and its effects. So Genesis 3 through 5 before we get into the story of Noah and the flood. First of all, I want to have you make sure you read through just Genesis 3. So if you have not done that yet, read through Genesis 3 before you answer this first question about the serpent here. So Genesis 3 verse 1 says, "Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made." So nowhere, very interestingly, is the serpent identified as Satan in Genesis 3 or in the rest of the Old Testament for that matter. So the origin of evil, when evil enters into the world through the serpent figure, it's a bit of a mystery. We hear stories about Lucifer and the rebellion of the angels in heaven, and we can get more into that in class if you have questions on that. But in Genesis 3, at least, there's no backstory at all to where the serpent comes from. It's just described as a crafty animal. So, after reading through Genesis 3 as well, I want to have you pause a minute and consider a question here about what the first sin actually was. So I want to have us look through now at three different ways the fall affects our relationship with God, one way, our relationship with each other, a second way, and our relationship with creation, a third way. So first of all, the fall affecting our human relationship with God. Adam and Eve, as a result of the story, if you read through chapter 3, are now exiled. They are banished. Exiled, though, is the word I like to use because exile is an important term that we'll see comes up later in the Old Testament again for the people of Israel. They're exiled from the Garden of Eden. They're banished from his presence. They experience, here's a term to remember, spiritual death. Now, it's interesting that Genesis 2, verse 9, if we back up a minute, says, "Out of the ground the Lord God made to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden," and then this got kind of cut off by the picture, I apologize, "but the tree of the knowledge of good and evil." So there's actually two trees, but only one of them, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, are Adam and Eve forbidden to eat from. In the day that you eat of it, God says, you shall die. So the tree of life is mentioned, but there's no command not to eat from that one. It's simply stay away from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So interestingly, though God tells Adam, in the day you eat of it, you'll die, we read in Genesis 5, verse 5, that Adam actually lived 930 years, and then he died. So important to point out here a moment that Adam does not, physically at least, die immediately in that day after eating the fruit. Rather, he lives for 930 years total. So, here's the big question. Were humans originally immortal, meaning unable to die, they would live forever? Or was this immortality a potential gift that Adam and Eve, humanity, all of us, could have had, but lost as a result of eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? Now, if we look elsewhere just for a moment in the Old Testament, we get some clues, I think, about what the Israelite writers of the Old Testament thought about what happens when we die. Job 7 verse 9 says this, "Just as a cloud dissipates and vanishes, those who go down to Sheol will not come back." We'll talk about what Sheol might mean in a minute. Looking at Ecclesiastes 9 verse 2 and 5 and 6, the same fate comes to all, the writer says, to the righteous and the wicked. As are the good, so are the sinners. The dead know nothing, and even the memory of them is lost. Just looking at those underlined parts. Never again will they have any share in all that happens under the sun. So the idea seems to be this. There was this idea in Old Testament thought of an underworld, a realm of all the dead, where all the dead go, righteous, wicked, good, bad. Interestingly, there's no talk, at least in most of the Old Testament, of humans going to heaven or hell. Those concepts don't really come up when they die in the Old Testament. And the idea of a resurrection, when we say, I believe in the resurrection of the body in the Apostles' Creed, in the end times when Jesus comes again, that idea of bodily coming back, resurrection, does not come up until the prophets. So in other words, through most of the Old Testament, this idea here of dying and then going to the underworld or Sheol is the idea they had of how the world worked. And we'll explain more maybe of what this diagram really means in class, but just note that the idea of the Israelites was you die, and that's basically it. You have some kind of shadow or shade of your former self that might go on living in this underworld, Sheol, but that's about it. So maybe I should have put this picture in here. Think of Hercules, if you know Hercules at all, maybe the Disney movie. You die in that kind of thought, and whether you're good or bad, you go to this underworld where Hades rules, right? This Greek god that is basically a symbol of the dead. And Hades, interestingly, is the Greek translation of Sheol in Hebrew. So, back to Genesis. The man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. And God also says eventually, to the dust you shall return, in his curse of Adam and Eve. So, could Adam and Eve have been eating from this tree beforehand to potentially allow them to keep living and living and living forever? Maybe. But either way, after they have this knowledge of good and evil, after they demand to be like God in that way and decide what's right and wrong themselves, they are punished with not being allowed to eat from that tree of life, whether they ate from it in the beginning or not. So again, the question is, were humans originally immortal, or was this simply a potential gift of God that Adam and Eve and the rest of us lost? Either way, I think the question, the answer has to do with at least the death that Adam and Eve experienced. It's a spiritual death. They're exiled spiritually from God, whether or not physical death was part of that punishment. So, in what sense is Israel similar to its neighbors to the east or west in thinking this way about death? Egypt, maybe some of you are familiar with, believed that once you died, you would live forever. So they had this very elaborate idea of when these pharaohs would die, they would be welcomed into this afterlife depending on their actions. On the other hand, the Epic of Gilgamesh, maybe some of you explored some of this in middle school, the idea is very much the opposite. You die, and that's it. So as for you, Gilgamesh, he's told, let your belly be full, make merry day and night, pay heed to the little one that holds onto your hand, delight in your spouse, so enjoy time with your family, because after you die, this is basically it. And I won't read all of this passage from Ecclesiastes, but just note again, that is your portion in life. There is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol to which you are going. You die, and after enjoying what God has given you in this life, that is it. So Israel, very much more influenced by Mesopotamia's view of the afterlife, where the Epic of Gilgamesh came, than the Egyptian view. The Israelites never really bought into the idea that it was possible for humans by themselves to live forever. That has to wait a gift from God. So, secondly, the fall affects the human relationships not only with God being spiritually exiled from him, but with each other. You have Adam and Eve blaming each other and the serpent for what they themselves were responsible for, right? So neither of them wants to take the blame. The woman made me do it, Adam says. And Eve says, no, the serpent made me do it. And don't we do that still today, too? We blame other individuals or other people, whether it's blaming someone for something that we did personally or blaming whole groups of people. All racism, think of that as maybe definitely an effective sin as well. We don't want to take responsibility for our individual or our group behavior. And then finally, the fall affects the human relationship with all of creation. We were supposed to, our mission was to work and take care of the world as God's image bearers. Now, as we keep doing so, there's going to be thorns, there's going to be thistles, there's going to be difficulty in working and in childbirth. Things are going to get miserable. All of creation, in some sense, sort of falls with Adam and Eve as God's image bearers after they sin. Where is their grace, though? God clothes Adam and Eve. So despite the judgment, the punishment, he covers up the shame of their nakedness, and he promises a deliverer. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. There is a deliverer coming. So, our mission was to fill the earth and subdue it, and we will come back to that as we begin class and work our way up towards Noah.